I moved into a new apartment with my family. And after that, inexplicable things started happening around me. Moving had always seemed like a fresh start to me. A new apartment, a new neighborhood, even a new phone number. My mom insisted I switch carriers because, as she put it, the old plan was draining our money faster than she could write a chapter of her new story. I didn't argue. Really, what did it matter? We were already struggling financially, and it wouldn't hurt to cut back on unnecessary expenses. I was 17, with my final exams coming up in a year, studying and spending my evenings on my phone, watching captivating YouTube videos. My life was routine, even with the promise of summer. But it didn't feel boring. It seemed like nothing could disrupt this fragile yet familiar order. I was wrong. I didn't like the apartment from the start. It wasn't because of its dilapidation or mold. On the contrary, the renovations were fresh, the walls were painted a soothing gray, and the floors were covered with laminate that still smelled like the store. It was the layout that bothered me. You opened the front door and immediately entered a long hallway with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, which didn't light up immediately but took half a second to decide whether to dispel the darkness. To the left, you could see the entrance to the spacious living room, which was also the kitchen. The space was bright and inviting. However, to reach the bathroom or the toilet, you had to walk down the hallway all the way to the end, passing by my bedroom on the right. Technically, it was a large room with a sofa, a TV, and my desk. However, its main feature was the presence of a second door. Behind it was another hallway, darker and narrower than the first. To the left, you could see my parents' bedroom, followed by my older sister's room, and at the very end, a door leading to a storage room. I immediately dubbed this area the appendix. It was a narrow, dark extension of the apartment that ended in a dead end. That first night, as I unpacked my boxes, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching my back from that dead end. The feeling was silly and childish, and I put it down to the stress of moving. Mom was happy. For her, as a writer, the new environment was a breath of inspiration. She immediately occupied the living room, spreading her laptop on the dining table, and promised that her best novel would be born here, within these walls. My sister, who recently turned 20, did not participate in the move. She had just left for some kind of student field trip, something between an internship and a camp, and was due to return only in a couple of weeks. I'm busy with my textbooks, exams are coming up, and I'm an introvert. The perfect combination to stay in my room for days. I activated my new phone number on the very first day, sent messages to a few friends, and forgot about it. 3 days after the housewarming party, I finally got out of my hiding place. I was invited to a party, nothing big, just a get-together with an old friend. I went more out of guilt over my own social phobia than out of any real desire. There were a lot of people, the music was hitting my ears, and I felt like a fish stranded on the shore. I was standing against the wall with a can of soda when Dan, my best friend since middle school, came staggering up to me. He smelled of beer, and his eyes were red. "Phew, have you found? Where have you been?" he asked, slapping me on the shoulder so hard that I almost dropped the jar. "What do you mean? I didn't go anywhere," I replied, smiling tightly. Dan looked at me blearily, and for a moment I saw something like relief. "I understand, bro. Existential crisis, self-search, and all that. But don't go out like that anymore, okay? We were really scared." "What are you talking about?" I tried to ask him again, but he was already being called from the other side of the room, and he waved at me and disappeared into the crowd. I attributed this conversation to Dan's alcohol intoxication and the general awkwardness of my stay here. You never know what you'll see when you're drunk. I left the party early, returned home, trying to walk down the creaking hallway as quietly as possible, and collapsed on the couch. I fell asleep instantly. I always slept soundly, and waking me up was no easy task. The next weeks, the monotonous routine continued. I almost did not leave the apartment, plunging into textbooks and tests. And that's because of this isolation, I began to notice strangeness. First in Mom. She was always a light, sincere woman, ready for hours to discuss, read books, or argue about story turns. But now she became silent, tense. Under his eyes, there were deep shadows that could not hide even the tonal cream, and the movements were Durgan, as if she were constantly waiting for the awkrick from behind the back. When I asked if it was all right, she always answered the same thing. "I said, honey. The scene was gone. Had to sit until morning. You know how it happens." I nodded, but there was a worm of doubt inside. She could have been sitting at work, but she had been inspired by her early nights, and now she looked cornered. The next weeks, the monotonous routine continued. I almost did not leave the apartment, plunging into textbooks and tests. And that's because of this isolation, I began to notice strangeness. First in Mom. She was always a light, sincere woman, ready for hours to discuss, read books, or argue about story turns. But now she became silent, tense. Under his eyes, there were deep shadows that could not hide even the tonal cream, and the movements were Durgan, as if she were constantly waiting for the awkrick from behind the back. When I asked if it was all right, she always answered the same thing. "I said, honey. The scene was gone. Had to sit until morning. You know how it happens." I nodded, but there was a worm of doubt inside. She could have been sitting at work, but she had been inspired by her early nights, and now she looked cornered. Something sucked out of her cheerful, leaving only a shell that mechanically cooked coffee and asked questions. I convinced myself that I was just spinning myself against stress. That nightmare happened about 3 weeks after moving. I slept on my couch, falling into the black, deep abyss in which there are no dreams. The awakening was sharp, as if from an electric discharge. I could not hear a sound, but I felt a touch of touch. But every cell of the body felt a look on my own. Heavy, sticky, unnatural hunger. I opened my eyes. Mom stood in the bottom of the couch and looked at me. The room was lit by the nightlife, and his dim light caught her figure from the darkness. The time on the phone showed 3 o'clock. She smiled widely. I pulled back into the cold wall. Something was monstrous. I saw that it was my mother, but not the one I saw today at dinner. It was a 10-year-old mother. Smooth skin, no wrinkles at the eyes, hair laid out as she wore when I was 7. And her smile. It was the most polite, strained smile she wore when someone was in a bad joke. My sister and I loved those moments. As one of us let go of a flat joke, like Mom stretched her lips in this rubber grimace, and we rolled with laughter. But now, at 3 o'clock in the night, that smile that had been frozen on the face that had not existed for 10 years was the most terrible sight in my life. "Mom, what's wrong with you?" I whispered, feeling the voice break. "We're just spending so little time with you, son," she said in my mother's voice, but the intonation was empty as the answering machine. "I decided to sleep with you today." The cold ran down his back, leaving the icy evaporating. Instead of screaming or running, I nodded. My brain, refusing to accept reality, chose the safest as he seemed to be tactic, to pretend that everything is normal. I lay back, facing the wall, and covered my blanket with my head. After a moment, the mattress swayed under the weight of the alien body. It lay right behind my back, and I felt his cold skin. And then I heard my breath. Slow, measured, but some mechanical, without pauses and failures, like a piston. It touched my back, and I lay afraid to move until I fell into sleep again. I woke up alone in the morning. The sun was shining through the windows, and the whole horror of the night seemed like a delusion. I went to my parents' bedroom. Mom was lying in bed, dressed in her usual pajamas, and looked like her usual self-attired woman in her early 40s, not a wax figure from the past. I stammered and asked if she had visited me at night. She put down the book, and her face turned white. She sighed heavily and said a phrase that made my stomach drop. "And he got to you." She admitted that she didn't want to scare me, but from the very first day, she felt that we weren't alone in the apartment. Every night, at exactly 2 o'clock, the door of the storeroom at the end of the corridor opened. Something was coming out. It skillfully takes on the appearance of those who lived here. Mom told me how that very evening, when I was leaving for a party, Me entered her bedroom at 4 in the morning. At first, everything was fine. Me was muttering something about not being able to sleep. And then, for a split second, my face changed. His features were distorted and elongated, revealing a row of thin, needle-like teeth. The mother stormed out of the room and locked herself in the bathroom until dawn. The real Me came back just in the morning. That's why she looked so bad all this time. Every night she hid, listening to the footsteps of bare feet in the hallway. "But you were acting like your usual self during the day," I whispered, feeling panic prickle in my side. "We were talking and you were cooking." "During the day?" She hesitated, looking right through me. "During the day, I'm not sure if it was me. Sometimes it seems to me that it pretends to be me, even when the sun rises." This confession broke some kind of fuse in me. I went back to my room and sat on the couch, staring at one point. Life turned into a thriller. The following nights I slept fitfully, waking up 2 or 3 times, and every time I held my breath, I heard it. The sound of a bare foot slowly treading on linoleum. It was coming from below, right from under my couch. Someone, or something, was walking there, in the narrow space between the floor and the bottom of the sofa, where even a cat couldn't squeeze through. I put my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. I began to analyze our way of life. The food in the fridge didn't run out. I remembered that yesterday I'd finished the cheese and finished the milk, but in the morning the package was full again. The soup in the pot did not decrease, even if I ate 3 plates in a row. I couldn't figure out how it worked, until I had a terrible hunch. What if it was something that specifically created the conditions for us to leave the house at a minimum? The climax came suddenly. The doorbell woke me up, sharp, piercing, insistent. The phone read 3 o'clock in the morning. My heart started pounding in my throat. Like a somnambulist, I went out into the dark corridor, clinging to the walls. Through the peephole in the door, I saw a blurry silhouette. I opened the lock, unable to resist the drowsy state. My sister was standing in the doorway. Her figure was exactly like in the last photo from social networks. The same jacket, the same jeans, the same backpack on his shoulders. But her face, her lips were pressed tightly into a thin line, and the corners of her mouth were twitching, as if she was trying her best to hold back wild, hysterical laughter. When I woke up, I saw this expression more clearly. Not laughter, not crying, but the creepy mask of a man who was about to burst out laughing. "I came back earlier," she said in her sister's voice, but her lips barely parted. I backed away, and then rushed into the bedroom to my mother. I needed help, confirmation that I wasn't crazy. I burst into my parents' bedroom. The bed was empty, perfectly made, not a wrinkle on the bedspread. No one had slept here for a very long time. At that moment, the hallway was filled with the sound of footsteps, slow, stealthy footsteps of bare feet on tiptoe. The sound was approaching from the living room, cutting off the way to the exit. I flew back into my parents' bedroom, slammed the door, and bolted it. Then, beside himself with horror, he hid in the closet, burrowing into his clothes. I could see the doorway through the cracks in the closet doors. The glass in the door was fluted, blurred, and through it I could make out the outline of a figure. It went to the door and stopped. I prayed for the first time in my life, choking on the words that I made up on the move. The creature did not try to enter. It just stood there, motionless. 3 o'clock. For 3 endless, hellish hours, I stared at the blurred silhouette of the head and shoulders until the first rays of the sun turned the glass gray. Only then the figure turned around and silently disappeared into the depths of the corridor, in the direction of the pantry. I didn't wait a second longer. Grabbing my wallet from my room and grabbing my phone, I ran barefoot into the hallway, opened the front door, and tumbled down the stairs. The fresh morning air burned my lungs, but I didn't care. I ran without looking back. I knew my friend's address by heart. Dan opened the door and stared at me with round eyes. He was sober, but his expression was much wilder than it had been that night at the party. Where have you been? Stop it, he yelled, pulling me into the hallway. Dude, we're all going crazy. A month has passed. What? I croaked. What month? Are you really serious? You've been missing for a month, bro. Where have you been? Dan grabbed my shoulders and shook me. Your mother almost lost her mind. Your sister arrived earlier from the departure. They plastered the whole area with ads. You left home with all your belongings and didn't answer your phone. My legs gave out. Derealization hit me like an icy wave. I staggered to a chair and sat down. A whole month. So I lived in that apartment for a whole month without going outside, eating food that didn't disappear, and talking to my mom who wasn't there. Dan handed me a phone with an open page of the city's public website. A missing persons announcement. My picture, my name. He left home exactly a month ago. The phone is unavailable. A request to everyone who saw. But I held the phone in my hands every day. I remember this new number. I dialed my mom's number from the old SIM card that Dan had forced into my cell phone. Beep. Another beep. Hello? A native, cracked voice rang out, alive, real, full of anxiety and tears. Mom, was all I could manage. Half an hour later, I was at the door of my old apartment, the one we had moved out of. My mother, who had lost weight and had red eyes from insomnia, threw her arms around my neck. She was crying, stroking my face, and I stood like a stone. My sister was standing next to me, just as real and warm. They both looked alive. There was a pain of loss in their eyes. You left and didn't come back, Mom whispered through her tears. We thought you were just going out, and then the phone went silent. We're off our feet. I looked at her tear-stained face and felt like reality was bursting at the seams. I had my keys in my pocket. I got them. The usual keys are on a keychain that I bought a month ago. I remembered the smell of paint in that hallway, the creak of floorboards in the appendix, and the cold breath behind me. I turned the keys over in my hand and thought about that other mother, the one who stayed in the apartment with the long hallway, the one who looked tired but who still made me coffee, asked about my studies, and wrote her novels at night. She was real, at least for me. And then, standing on the threshold of my own house with my sobbing mother, I felt a familiar chill coming from behind me, from the open doorway of the stairwell. It was as if that apartment hadn't completely let me go. It was as if the corridor ending in the storeroom had simply shrunk to the size of my consciousness, and now it would always be waiting for me to close my eyes. I looked at my mother's handkerchief, at my sister, and I couldn't get rid of the chilling question, which one of them is the real one? And most importantly, are all three of us a real person now?